Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about one of the biggest questions in all of our Catholic faith. Why, if we are made good and holy and in God's image, do we sin? Sin is kind of a loaded term. There's a lot of connotations and ideas about what it means. But for our purposes, we're going to define sin as like choosing to do something that is bad, immoral, evil, or maybe against God, against love. Choosing to do something that is not loving. And we should clarify that this is not doing something bad or wrong on accident. That's a whole other philosophical, theological conversation that can be had. But for our purposes, we're talking about sin as like a deliberate choice when you know something is wrong, when you know a choice is not the loving, God-like choice, you make that decision anyway. And so to talk about sin in this context, we first need to establish this idea of conscience, that there is some part of you in your brain, in your heart, in your soul, that knows what is right and wrong. I like to think about conscience in terms of like internal priorities you have that tells you when like certain things are more important than other things. So for instance, if I went to a store and I stole something, there are a couple priorities at play within me. So first, like the higher priority is that I should be respecting this other company person's right to own that thing that I'm taking. And then a lower priority is my desire to possess that thing myself. And so what I'm doing when I'm sinning in that situation is I am moving that lower priority into a higher position, and I am kind of ignoring what my conscience is telling me and deciding to choose that thing that is more for me. And we can see this idea of sin as ignoring your priorities, ignoring your conscience in the Adam and Eve story, which is where we as Catholics really understand this idea of what it means to sin. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story, but God makes the Garden of Eden, he makes Adam and Eve, he puts them in there. He says, you can eat from any fruit in this garden except for the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and then he kind of goes away, leaves them to their own devices. Eve gets kind of talked into trying some of the fruit by a snake. She takes a bite, she shares it with Adam, he takes a bite, and then both of them have sinned. They have chosen to do something against their conscience, against what they knew was wrong. Now this story is not a literal retelling of two people who were in a garden and ate a piece of fruit, but it does kind of show us human nature in a very unique way, in the way that we understand the world. It brings into focus this idea that we have of original sin as Catholics, which really, the word original sin just means it's the reality that by our human nature, by being a part of the created world, we are flawed and we will be tempted to sin. We will be tempted to act in a way that is against our conscience, against what we know is right. And it's important to note that original sin and this idea that like each human being will be tempted to sin, will be tempted to do wrong, to make the wrong choice, to choose against love, to choose against God. This is a natural thing. It is a part of our human nature. Original sin is just a part of the created world, a part of like who we are as people, is that we will be tempted to choose the wrong choice. And really the things that we think of as sin or bad or evil are natural parts of human nature and human history. Every society, every nation, every person from the beginning of time to now has been tempted to start fights, to go to war, to exclude people from their society, to make people outcasts, even to just generally devalue the lives of others, to not recognize their human dignity, their worth as individuals for whatever reason. And so the question we have is, why? If we are made good, if creation is made good, if we are made in God's image, why do we still have this temptation? Why is it a reality that we will sin and we will choose wrong in certain situations? Put another way, why didn't God make us perfect? Why didn't God make us so that we can be untemptable, so that we will never choose the wrong thing? We will always choose love, choose God, choose good. And well, this is a very complicated question, and there's kind of a lot of ways you could come at the issue. One that I think is really helpful for us is going back to our premise that God is love. Love is kind of the answer for why we have to have the ability to sin. We are made out of love and we are made to love, but love has to be a freely given choice. There's a really great discourse in the Harry Potter franchise, and I think both the books and the movies, about like love potions and how in that universe, in that world, they aren't really copying love, they're copying like attraction and interest, because love has to be a freely given choice. It has to be a decision that you make, that you're not being forced into, that you're not being guilted into. You are freely choosing to love or not to love someone. And a great example of this is just to think about gifts. We're getting close to the Christmas season. When you love someone, you can give them a gift, and that is a sign of this love and affection you feel for them. But it wouldn't be the same thing if they take you to the store and tell you, you have to buy this thing for me, and they force you to buy them that gift. That is not a gift anymore, and that's not love anymore, because you are being forced into it. It's not something that is a free choice that you are making. This is all a little philosophical, but basically the takeaway is that it is not love if you don't have the choice not to love. And so that is really related to this idea of human nature, why we are affected by original sin, why we are affected by temptation, and why we will choose things that are wrong or immoral or against God, is because we have to have that option for us to be made of love and made to love. The reality is just that we as humans and the world that we live in is flawed and imperfect. And that's just how it has to be because of how we understand how love works. What matters for us is how we are responding to that reality of the flaws that we see in ourselves, in others, in the world around us. We don't really have a choice about whether or not we can be tempted to sin, whether or not we can be tempted by these things, but we do have a choice about how we respond. On the one hand, when we are tempted, when we sin, we can just rationalize it and pretend that it's not a real issue. Thinking about our priorities, we could reorder them so that it doesn't really seem like a sin anymore. Going back to talking about stealing, I decide that my need to have this item in my life is more important than the store owner's right to possess this thing, because they're corrupt, or they have so many they won't even notice if one is missing. So I just take those priorities and I reorder them so that what I'm doing is no longer an issue. It's no longer a sin in my mind. I have kind of reformulated my conscience so it's not an issue anymore. Obviously, in reality, I'm still stealing in an objective sense of truth. That's still a bad thing. But to me, I've kind of convinced myself that it's no longer an issue, and I have rationalized it. I've kind of denied that it's a sin in the first place. The other option is to recognize that we as humans, that we as a created world, are in need of salvation, in need of someone who can call us to be better, of someone who can show us how to be better, and of someone who can call us to become more than just our human nature. And this is sort of the next step in talking about the kerygma, these foundations of our faith, that we now live in a redeemed, saved world through the person of Christ. But for now, just know that we are imperfect, we are flawed, we do have issues, obviously, but that is so we are free to choose God and free to choose love.